G'day and welcome to another gun related video on my channel. Now this rifle here is a Sportco Model 44 target rifle, chambered in a 7.62 NATO. Now it's made in Australia by the Sportco Firearms Manufacturing Company. So what I want to do is I'm going to do a review of this rifle. I want to look at the history of the Sportco Firearms Manufacturing Company and the biography of its founder, because it's not just simply a matter of someone starting a gun company and making guns for a while. The Sportco company is no longer in existence. I think whether you're an Australian or whether you're American or some other nationality, I think you'll find the biography of the Sportco Firearms Company's founder a very interesting story. I grew up in Adelaide, which is the capital city of South Australia. There's a main road going through the southern suburbs of Adelaide called South Road. Head south, funnily enough. I used to go along there all the time with my family and my friends, you know, once I got my licence at 16. And there used to be a factory that I drove past that was obviously an arms manufacturing factory. Anyway, I'll show you a photo of the factory. It's actually got the sign on there that I used to see, so have a look at this. Judging by the old cars, this photo is a lot before my time. The founder of Sportco was Jack Warne, his full name being John Llewellyn Warne. And here's a contemporary photo of him testing one of their single barrel shotguns. He was born in Adelaide in 1923, and when he was a young child, his father, who was a barber, moved the whole family to the town of Kimber in the westernmost part of the settled area of South Australia. Kimber, K-I-M-B-A. Now just remember that name of that town, because it becomes important later on. Now, you may not be aware, South Australia is a very large state, but the vast majority of it is desert. It's really only the southernmost parts of the state are settled for farming and stuff. The rest of it is either desert or just open rangeland, cattle country. And Kimber is actually in the wheat belt in the very western part of the settled part of South Australia. Very large farms there, mainly growing wheat and wool, sheep. And so Jack basically grew up in Kimber. I read an article that said his father owned a French single-shot 22 rifle, and Jack used to go out hunting rabbits with that. So that was where he got his start in firearms. So Kimber's actually about 300 miles from Adelaide. So it's actually fairly remote even now. I mean, it's probably a town of a couple of thousand people now. But back in the mid to late 1920s, it would have been very remote and a very small little town. He grew up in the 20s. He ended up going to work, and when he was young, he did a bit of kangaroo shooting and stuff, so he had access to firearms, but he wasn't really a gun guy. And I think during the war, he got work in some actual metal working companies in Adelaide, and actually learnt quite a lot about metal fabrication. And he decided that he was really interested in manufacture, just manufacture in general. He wanted to have his own business and he wanted to make something, manufacture something. So he was only in his early 20s, remember this, when he started. He initially went into business with a fellow called Kosh, I think, and they started making tricycles, little tubular steel tricycles. So this was back in the late 40s, I think, like just after the war. It was really successful. Like, you know, they were kind of selling as many as they could make, so they made a bit of money. So then Jack was thinking, well, what else can I make that there's a demand for that no one else is making? And he obviously knew a few people. I don't know if he was actually into shooting himself, maybe he was, but he knew a few people who were. And at that time in Australia, there was a few things going on as far as shooting went. The first was that there was just very little sporting firearms being imported. There was very, you just couldn't go out and go to the shop and buy an American or British rifle that easily. But there was lots and lots of number one Mark III SMLEs, or number one Mark III Star. Most of them would have been surplus from the Second World War. So the government was selling them off really cheaply, and so people were buying them for hunting, and a lot of them were being sporterised. But there was a couple of things going on about that. I mean, most people were only shooting things like kangaroos, wallabies, pigs, and 303 was, overly powerful, and people didn't have a lot of money back then. So if you could use less, cheaper bullets and cheaper everything, it was good. And the other problem was, which is not really mentioned in a lot of the histories, but I know this from reading other general histories on shooting in Australia, is after the war, the New South Wales government, now New South Wales is by far the most populous state. That's where Sydney is. And New South Wales had a law, just like a lot of other countries, like, they still have it in places like Mexico, I think, and Italy, I think. They've had it in the past in France, a lot of other countries, where it's illegal for general civilians to own firearms in military calibers. So in New South Wales, even though there was heaps of 303 SMLEs being sold, you weren't actually allowed to own a 303 SMLE. So there was actually shooters in Australia were actually starting to wildcat the 303. So they were producing 303-22, 303-25 and 303-270 were the three main ones. There was companies making cartridges, making brass. The super cartridge companies was making brass and selling cartridges in those calibers. But you needed to buy barrels. You obviously, if you're going to convert an SMLE, you had to actually get a barrel. And there was really no one making barrels, sporting barrels, and it was sort of difficult to import them from the USA. So Jack thought, there's an opportunity. How hard can it be to make rifle barrels? He's in for a bit of a shock, actually, but they got some machinery together and decided to start making rifle barrels. And it's obviously not a simple thing, even though he was skilled in general metal fabrication. But luckily he had somehow, I can't remember how, if you watch that interview, he talks about it, he actually managed to get a contact in the Lithgow. Now Lithgow Small Arms Factory at that time was government owned. It's in the town of Lithgow, not far from Sydney. And that's where all Australia's small arms were made. And he managed to go and visit the small arms factory. Actually happened to know someone who knew the manager of barrel making there. So they went over there and looked at how they made barrels at the Lithgow factory. And then came back and got some machinery and started drilling barrels. But had a bit of a problem, had to go back and work it out. But anyway, in the end, they managed to successfully make rifle barrels, and there was an insatiable demand for them, and they did really well selling those. Now, after their success making the little tricycles, Jack and his partner started making copies of the Daisy BB, or I'm not sure exactly whether they probably weren't rifled. I think they were just like a BB gun, and that was quite successful. But one thing that was in real short supply was air gun pellets. So Jack used to go down to the second-hand or the metal recycling place down at Alberton on the way to Port Adelaide, and buy old second-hand lead, probably roofing sheets or something, roofing flashing. Took it back to the factory, and they worked out a method of making air rifle pellets. And so their company, it was actually called Koch Warne KW. So there's actually, I can show you a photo of an original packet of KW air rifle pellets. Now, after the success of that, they were actually approached by the Hills Hoist Company. Now, any Australian is going to know what a Hills Hoist is. Most people who aren't Australian are going to have no clue what I'm talking about. The Hills Hoist was a product that just about every Australian household had in their backyard. It's something for drying your clothes. It's made out of tubular galvanised steel with galvanised wire. It can be wound up and down. It can rotate in the breeze. They were developed and manufactured by a company in Adelaide. The Hills Hoist Company actually approached Jack and his partner about buying steel from them, buying tubular steel from them rather than from British tube mills where they had been buying it, because they could get it cheaper from Kosh and Warne. And at that point, I think Jack and Kevin, his partner, decided that they really wanted to go in two dimensions. I think his partner was still interested in tubular steel kind of manufacturing, and Jack was wanted to get into firearms manufacturing. So the partnership was dissolved, and Kevin continued to work in tubular steel manufacturing. And Jack actually, that's at the point where he actually started the Sporting Arms Company Proprietary Limited, Sportco. Once the barrel making was successful, then they expanded and started making whole firearms. They figured, we can make barrels, how hard can it be to make a firearm? So again, they had to work out how to make stocks, you know. But at about that time, they were lucky that the Lithgow Small Arms Factory had a whole lot of machinery they wanted to sell off. You know, they were obviously getting new machines or something, and so he was able to buy all sorts of firearm making, barrel making, you know, mills and whatever machines from Lithgow for peanuts, basically. You know, like a machine that may have cost tens of thousands of dollars, they got for $100 sort of thing. So they went over there and bought several semi-trailer loads full of this machinery and shipped it back to Adelaide. So yeah, they set up a full factory, you know, a full manufacturing facility on South Road at Clovelly Park. I'm not sure exactly what all the dates are of these. I think that probably would have been back in the 50s. In the early 1960s, the Australian government put out a tender to sell off all their Martini Cadet training rifles. Now, if you're not familiar with those, I've got one here. If you don't really know much about it or about the history, I've actually got a video. I'll just link it up the top here if you want to watch it now just to see, or watch it later. I'll link it in the description as well. These were a training rifle. The government bought about 60,000 of them, I think, back in the first years of the 20th century, before the First World War. Their Martini action, they're chambered in 310, what was originally 310 greener, which has now more commonly come to be called the 310 Cadet cartridge, because this is the main rifle it was chambered in. But anyway, in the 60s, the government decided they wanted to get rid of them, so they put out tenders. And Jack put in a tender, and he actually won the tender. I don't know what the figure was, but they would have been pretty cheap, just a few dollars each probably. And so he got 40,000 of these, and almost immediately after, you know, he was successful in the tender, the company who was bidding against him in the tender process and missed out, they contacted him and made him a really good offer to buy half of them. So it was basically, I think it was actually as much or even more than he'd actually paid for the whole 40,000. So he sold 20,000 of them to this company. I can't remember what it's called. I'll just put it on the screen, the name of the company. And so 20,000 of them got shipped off to the US. So there's a lot of Martini Cadets in the US, and that's where they came from. They were part of this 20,000 shipment that had gone over there. So anyway, then Sportco then had 20,000 of these rifles, probably in various states of repair. Some of them made like this one. Like this is really beautiful. This one. Now they were mainly BSAs. Like this one. This is a BSA. Some of them were Wesley Richards, and some of them were Greeners as well. And not all of them were in 310. Some of them were actually the really early ones in 297, 230 Morris, which is a little tiny 22 caliber centre fire round. What they did with these rifles, they used the actions, but they discarded the rest, and they made a variety of 22 caliber, 22 long rifle caliber sporting rifles. They made a really nice high spec target rifle with peep sights called the Clubman.
It's actually called the Clubmaster.
They had a Clubman bolt action target rifle before that.
This one's actually called the Clubman.
And what they did was they actually ground, they got the little kangaroo on the top, so they ground all the markings off. They ground the kangaroo off the top, the markings off the sides, including the 0 number, and then they re-stamped them as Sportco, whatever model it is, and the new serial number, and sold them as that. When they got low in the numbers, when they'd sold most of them, they then, the remaining ones, that's when they actually produced the Clubman target rifle. Actually, I read that somewhere. They just kept they probably kept the best of the actions, the tighter ones as well, for these Clubman rifles. So yeah, when you see a Sportco small frame Martini rifle, you may not realise that it started out, it spent sort of 60 years as an Australian training rifle before it was rebuilt as a sporting rifle. Sometime in the early 60s, Jack was looking at diversifying Sportco, looking at more products. The Australian firearms market was probably fairly limited because of just the smallish population and the limited number of people who were shooting. They did do a little bit of exporting. They exported to the United Kingdom and Canada. At that stage, I don't think they exported anything to the US. Yeah, so Jack was thinking, what else can they make? And he actually, I'm not sure where he came up with the idea, but he thought about cartridge-fired construction guns. Concrete, like nail guns, like ramset sort of guns for concrete. Cartridge-fired. So, because apparently there was a shortage of those, and apparently at the time they were being made by 3 companies in America: Winchester, Remington, and Omark, which is based in Oregon. And Omark was actually a company owned by one guy whose name escapes me now. I'll put it up on the screen for you. Jack actually wrote to those companies and wanted to know if they were interested in some sort of manufacturing deal where he could manufacture their design in Australia for the Australian market. Winchester and Remington weren't interested, but Omark's owner was very interested and invited Jack to come over and talk about it. So he went over. They signed up a deal, and it ended up being a really close business and personal relationship that basically lasted for life. And during this whole time of rifle manufacturer, they continued to have a close relationship with Omark and made these Omark designed nail guns. When they decided that they needed more capital to expand the factory, they decided to sell, or go public. I don't really understand the full financials of it, but basically when they went public, Omark, I think, initially bought 25% of the company's stock, but then in 1966 he sold the whole company to Omark, so this American company. So Omark weren't really a firearms company. They, as I said, they made nail guns. Apparently they made a lot of other things, I think. But they weren't a firearms company. And then when Jack sold Sportco to Omark, the owner of Omark invited Jack to come over to the US and be a major executive in the Omark company. So he did that. He went over and worked for Omark. And they were looking at ways to diversify. So we're sort of going off on a bit of a tangent here away from the Sportco story. I'll go back to the Sportco story in a little while. So Jack moves to Oregon and he looked around and said, okay, what businesses are there? Did the same thing basically that he'd done 20 years before in Adelaide. What businesses can we look at and manufacture? What can we manufacture? And he knew the gun market now. At that time, in the mid 60s, shooting obviously was always big in the USA, but hand loading wasn't really big. Hand loading was a bit of a niche market. Most people just bought their ammo and shot it off. So there was a small core group of serious shooters there was people who were doing wildcatting for a start. There was Newton and some of these other guys, Ackley. Jack heard of, or he was introduced or met these two brothers. Their name was Speer. There was Dick Speer, and there was Vernon Speer. Vernon Speer had actually started a company making projectiles. It was a little tiny, company, and he had his back shed sort of thing, and he was making projectiles and selling them, and it was very successful. It was expanding, but probably as a lot of companies had limited capital. And then Dick Speer, his brother, he had started making, because there was a limited stock of a lot of unusual cartridges, he'd started trying to make cartridge cases. He called it the Cascade Cartridge Company, and or CCI for short. But he soon found that because the war, that wasn't that long after the war, it was very hard to get good quality brass, and he was just having problems manufacturing cases successfully. But then he realised that there was the other thing that was difficult to get, because the government was making most of them, or buying up most of them from the companies that were making, was primers. It was very hard to get primers. So Dick Speer then kind of moved his Cascade Cartridge Company over into making primers. But again, he was a chicken farmer, I think, and it was actually like in some old chicken sheds. Or maybe he wasn't a chicken farmer, maybe he bought a chicken farm, but apparently he had these old chicken sheds on a farm, and I think this was in Oregon as well. He was making his primers, and there's just a small concern. Jack was sort of in charge of the acquisition sort of part of Omark, so he approached these guys and said, look, can we buy you out, And they probably could still keep working there or come to some sort of arrangement. And so Omark bought both the Speer projectile company and the CCI primer company. And we both know, we all know where that went. They put capital into them, expanded them, and apparently the CCI facility is actually still on the same land that the chicken farm was on, 60 years ago. Then after that success, he in charge of the Omark company, acquisitions part of Omark. They bought Weaver, they bought Outers, Weaver makes scopes obviously, from, Weaver, the Mr. Weaver who made the scopes. Outers, who make all the cleaning gear. What else did they buy? Oh, and RCBS. Eventually they also bought RCBS from Dick Huntington, I think his name was, reloading. So they now had projectiles, primers, scopes, cleaning gear, reloading gear, and firearms from Sportco. So while he was still working for Omark, Jack's son Greg had actually attended the University of Adelaide. He grew up in Adelaide, had attended the University of Adelaide and done an economics degree. So and of course Jack was living in the USA. So then Greg came over to the USA, and he went to I can't remember which university there. Jack mentions it in his interview. Did a MBA, I think, Master of Business Administration, and then in 1979, while Jack was still working for Omark, so Jack obviously helped and probably provided capital. and Greg actually provided the management, and they opened another firearms manufacturing company, and they named the new company Kimber after the town where Jack grew up. But instead of having it K-I-M-B-A, they put ER on the end because they just thought it would be easier for people to, remember to spell it that way. Started manufacturing rifles. So in 1980 they started with the model 82 bolt-action rifle, 22. And they were lucky that the United States Army was looking for a training rifle, and they almost immediately bought 20,000 of their M82A version target rifle.
And if you look at the action and the bolt, it bears a striking resemblance to the Sportco Model 66.
For training US troops. So in 1985, Jack decided to retire from Omark. So in the time that Jack was working for Omark, it went from being a reasonably successful company into a major company, probably one of the major companies manufacturing for the firearms industry. Steering Omark from being a sort of industrial nail gun, other stuff company into the firearms industry. Anyway, so 1985 he retired, but he kind of didn't want to sit around, and he still had this absolute passion for manufacture. He decided he was going to start another company, so he looked around, where is there an opening in the firearms industry for a high quality manufactured product? And he saw scope mounts, scope rings and mounts.
And so he started the Warne Scope Mount and Ring Manufacturing Company.
The first product that he produced was a quick detachable scope mounting system, which was actually designed by Len Brownell, of Brownells. The Brownells, the big shooting supply company. Well, that was actually started by Len Brownell, who had, I think, been a gunsmith. He designed this QD mount system, and Jack, I'm not sure of the actual financial, whether he made them under license or he just bought the patent, but he started making these quick detachable mounts. That was his first product, and then he expanded to a wide variety of mounts and rings, which are made to this day. I think after a few years, once the company became successful, he sold it and finally retired completely. I think he was getting up, in his late 70s, 80 years old by then. And Jack died in May of 2019. He lived his whole life, after he moved over to the US, he lived his whole life in Oregon, and he had children. So there you go. It's a shame. I remember when I was quite young, I used to see new Sportco rifles. When I was in my teens. Sportco finished in the mid 80s, I think. They closed up. So I'm sure you'll agree that's a fairly interesting story if you're into shooting and you use Speer bullets and CCI primers and other products that are owned by Omark, Warne scope mounts, or mainly if you're Australian, you may well have a Sportco rifle or shotgun. I've got, as you saw at the beginning of the video, I now fairly recently acquired my first and only Sportco rifle. As a Australian who was born and grew up in Adelaide, it was kind of quite good to see a success story like that from someone who was born in Adelaide like me and grew up in South Australia, but also from an American perspective. He did a lot for the shooting industry. So now what I'm going to quickly do is, I'm not going to go into too much detail because this video is already quite long, but I just want to give just a quick overview of Sportco products. Of course, during the story of Jack Warne's life, I did mention that Jack sold the Sportco company in the end to Omark Industries, and they owned it from 1966 right through until it closed down in the mid 80s. I think it was 84 maybe.
Here's quite a late advertisement from a shooting magazine showing their product line, and as you can see, they were also the importers and distributors of Parker Hale.
But as far as the actual Sportco firearms go, it really didn't make any difference. They continued developing new products, and there was a variety of Sportco products over the years. Towards the end, I don't know exactly when, but I have seen, like when I see ads for rifles online, some of them are marked Sportco, you know, and then it says something like made by the Omark Corporation, and they're often advertised as Omark-Sportco such and such, you know, model rifle.
Sportco did a lot of advertising back in the day, and there's a lot of ads available for you to look at online. Sportco's first rifle was a simple single shot rifle which they called the Huntsman. The most common bolt action repeater rifle encountered is the Model 62. The 71A was a popular semi-auto. Unfortunately, most of these have now been destroyed since the 96 gun grab, when semi-autos were basically made illegal. However, one interesting thing about this is it was bought by the British as a some sort of sub-caliber training rifle for their Chieftain tanks. The military designation for these was the L29A1 and L29A2. Here's a diagram that you can see of the barreled action mounted in a Chieftain tank. The Model 90 was an unusual box magazine fed pump action rifle that was a bit similar to the original old Savage Model 1904. Sportco made a bolt action repeating rifle in 22 Hornet, as well as the Model 33 in 222. Martini centerfires built on the Cadet actions as previously mentioned were chambered in both 22 Hornet and also 222 rimmed, which was a rim version of the 222. It had to be rimmed because the Martini action would not work with a rimless cartridge. Over the years, Sportco also made a range of models of single shot shotguns in various gauges. They made a range of firearms related accessories. Sportco also sold a range of ammunition under their brand name, although they didn't make it. It was actually made by other commercial ammunition manufacturers. In the late 1960s, Sportco developed a full-bore target rifle, single shot bolt action. It's the Model 44. As you can see, the early ones like mine have a very much military configuration stock, but later on they changed the stock style to a much more sporting one. I'm not going to go into these anymore at this point because my very next video is a description and review of my Sportco Model 44 target rifle. The last model of rifle developed by Sportco was the Model 66. This is a very high quality rifle, really solid receiver. They redesigned the magazine slightly, and it came in two general models. There was the Model 66S or standard, which is this one. Then there was the Model 66D, which was a deluxe version. It had much better sights, nicer wood with hand checkering, and was just much higher quality. In the early 1980s, Sportco came to an arrangement with Winchester whereby they manufactured barreled actions from the Model 66 and sold them to Winchester, where they were sent over to the US and stocked and completed as the Winchester Model 320. These were also sold in Australia, so the Model 320 and the Model 66 were sold side by side for a time. The Model 66 Sportco and Winchester 320 had a different magazine design to all the earlier Sportco models.
So I hope you enjoyed that video about Jack Warne's life and the history of the Sportco Firearms Company down in Adelaide. I've obviously had to just scratch the surface as far as the information goes, but there's a lot more information available. I'll put down in the description, I'll put a link to the YouTube video which shows the interview with Jack Warne, and I'll also put the website. There's actually a Sportco history based website, sportco.org.au, I think it is. I'll put that down the bottom too, so if you go to that website and then go to the history, it shows you all sorts of stuff. They've got lots of old catalogues, advertising. They've got some articles from various magazines, shooting and outdoor magazines over the years. So there's a lot of information about Sportco there. And if you just want to look at some Sportco models, just Google Sportco images. There's a heap of images online of firearms that have been either for sale at the moment or been sold over the years, and the photos are still up, so you can see a lot of the models, see photos of a lot of the models there. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for my next video description and review of the Sportco / Omark Model 44 target rifle. And until next time, thanks for watching.